Hey everyone, I'm Ramble, and I love fantasy. Like, a lot, if you can't tell by the type of content that I make. Stuff in the genre like magic, dragons, spooky ancient ruins, and dangerous dungeons that have to be solved with clever puzzles. I just eat all of that stuff up. But do you know what I find extra cool? The creatures. The weird, wild, and wonderful monsters and fantasy races that you can find just everywhere in the genre. And something that I always really liked is that each one tends to have a very specific vibe associated with them, particularly in the type of arms and armor that they are often depicted using. I always thought that was really cool, and the people that build these fantasy worlds put so much effort and thought into that part of the setting. And as somebody who doesn't nearly get enough opportunities to delve into those small, tiny, detailed pieces, I decided that I was going to make a series where I get to do exactly that. So welcome everybody to the very first episode of Forged by Fable, a series where we will talk about the classic fantasy species and monsters, and have a casual dive into what kind of weapons and armor make sense for them to use, based on all the nerdy stuff like biology, environment, and just plain cool factor. And, as a little treat, I'll even throw in a little bit of lore from my own setting here and there, in case you're a DM, or a writer, or if you just want some inspiration for your next homebrew. Now that introductions are out of the way, let's start talking about our very first monster. Let's start talking about snake people. Now, I don't know if you know this, but snakes are really cool. They are a very interesting type of creature, and have evolved some pretty amazing traits that result in some very effective natural abilities that help them to be as successful as they are. So I think, naturally, abilities that snakes have developed, snake people would also likely have. And one trait that is pretty common across most snakes is the ability to strike, where a snake will just coil up like an angry spring and suddenly leap towards whatever they want to attack. Real-world snakes can strike incredibly quickly, and at a considerable distance as well, depending on how long they are. A lot of snakes can strike as far as half of their total body length, and if we scale that up to a human-sized snake person, that ability would be pretty terrifying. Just for fun, let's say that a snake person averages around 20 feet long. That's about as long as your average green anaconda. A 20-foot-long snake person theoretically would be able to strike as far as 10 feet. 10 feet is a huge distance in a fight. It way outreaches how far a human would be able to lunge by a lot. And if we keep the relative speed of how fast a snake can strike, a snake person's strike would likely be incredibly fast as well. Striking on its own is a really effective tactic, but snakes in nature have shown two distinct hunting styles that are very successful and would be fantastic options for snake people in a fantasy setting to employ. And those hunting styles are Constriction and Venom. Of the two of these hunting styles, Constriction is by and large the most common type, and it's pretty easy to see why. Being able to effectively turn yourself into a slithering hydraulic press at any time is a pretty big advantage. Besides being able to give the best full-body hugs out there, these sentient slap bracelets would be capable of some truly awesome feats of power. Going back to real-world snakes, some of the larger snakes, like our previous comparison of the green anaconda, are able to produce an average of 90 pounds per square inch of crushing force. And personally, I believe a snake person, being larger, more muscular, and probably preys on much larger animals than a green anaconda, would be putting out way more than 90 psi. And just to show you how crazy of a baseline that is, 90 psi is about the same as an elephant stepping on your chest. So, for snake people, we're talking a level of muscle strength that could easily crush bones, pop joints out of sockets. So when you consider that level of strength, a human getting wrapped up by a constricting snake person, they're pretty much done. The level of speed and force that a constricting snake person can put out, it would be overwhelming to deal with. Even somebody wearing armor wouldn't be able to protect against that. It would just crush their armor in and turn them into a stress toy. That is not a pretty way to go. But, you know, some people might be into it. Once you start figuring out the abilities of these types of snake people, you have to wonder, how would that influence a society where these snake people are present? Like, if a town had a few people in it who could turn things into pulp if they squeezed it too hard, how would their lives work? Just as an example, constricting snake people, or lamia, as they are known in my setting, are the most common type of snake person out there. And the ones that are born into a lamia majority area are encouraged to be warriors, using their natural power to aid in the military might of their town. But many find fulfillment in a civilian life, using their natural ability of constriction to do things like shaping mounds of clay, making artistic pottery, or crushing grapes for a unique tasting wine squeezed between their very scales, or giving the absolute best spinal adjustments that you can get. And the ones that do decide to become hunters or fighters train this incredible crushing force they're able to put out to defend their homes against the myriad of dangerous threats that exist around them, up to and including to crush and choke out dinosaurs. Which is kind of a funny thing to think about. You have to just imagine the spectacle of a constricting snake person wrapping around the neck of a T-Rex like an extra dangerous necklace and just choking it out. But it ain't stupid if it works. Constriction is terrifying enough on its own, but some snake people also have the ability to produce and use venom, which, having a constantly replenishing source of venom, would be a huge advantage in the snake person's favor. But that does bring up the question of how would a snake person's tactics change when they have a source of renewable venom? Well, the main thing that I think snake people would do with their venom is use it to coat their weapons, adding in a new layer to their combat style. Now, all of a sudden, a glancing blow becomes a much more serious problem. A cut, no matter how minor, is no longer considered a lucky break. It's a countdown, as trace amounts of venom start slowly spreading out. And depending on the potency and type of venom produced, that would also change how it was used. Some snake people might produce a venom that is a potent neurotoxin that causes vivid hallucinations or disrupts coordination, while others could have a venom that causes blood clots on contact that causes excruciating pain. In my setting, venomous snake people tend to be collected into a priest class called the Zarathi, a group of esteemed priestesses of the serpent goddess Marasai, who specialize in the magic of venomancy. These venomous snake people handle all sorts of religious ministrations and rituals, as well as the harvesting and concentration of the sacred toxins of both themselves and the world around them, to both aid in the success of the hunters and war parties, but also to effectively create new types of medicine to help them survive in the harsh jungle landscape that they often live in. But many who do not follow this religious calling can also find careers in things like medicine or in more dangerous professions such as assassination. When you add in a factor like Venom that can be applied on the spot, it's really nasty, and these only get more deadly as you add in things like armor and weapons. And you know, it really does get interesting when you start thinking about how armor would even work on what is essentially a big snake, weird person body or not. And the thing that comes to mind is that a snake person would have a pretty big weakness when it comes to armor, and that is the fact that the belly of a snake, the part of them that is in contact with the ground, that can't be covered, or else the snake can't move. Real-world snakes, as I understand it, are capable of moving through a combination of directional friction and weight distribution. They effectively push against surfaces with the scales they have on their bellies, which act as sort of their feet, essentially. Which means that you can't cover that because they move with those belly scales being in contact with the ground. So if you armor up the underside of a snake body, you've just made them completely immobile. It would be like wearing a cast over your entire lower body, which is a huge disadvantage for the snake people. They basically can't armor the largest part of their body in any significant way. So what part of their body can a snake person actually armor? Well, the torso, their arms, maybe a helmet as well. Whatever armor a snake person does wear needs to be flexible and protective. And for that, you don't really need to look farther than chainmail. Mail, specifically riveted chainmail, would be absolutely perfect for a creature like a snake person who values high mobility and range of movement. Mail allows for all of that. It's probably the most freedom of movement you can get while still having a pretty robust armor. However, there are two other types of armor that are similar that I think could also work really well, and those are scale mail and lamellar. Scale and lamellar are different armors, but for the most part they share a lot of similarities and have the same benefits. Both are made from tons of little plates, usually metal, sewn either together in the case of lamellar or into leather and cloth in the case of scale. All of these little plates are placed in overlapping rows that sort of mimic the general appearance of the scales of a fish. Both of these armors are super flexible, though not as much as chain is. But scale and lamellar are both much easier to repair than chain, and, just as an aesthetic thing, it looks incredible. You get this wonderful, scale-like texture that would fit snake people both aesthetically and functionally. But even with these types of worn armor, snake people are still pretty under-armored. So much of their bodies are basically unprotected, so for that reason alone would be highly likely to use a shield of some kind. Ideally, I think they'd want to use ones that are large enough to cover big portions of their body, maybe something like a large round shield or a kite shield or the like. Which I think would make a lot of sense for them. Since a snake person can't wear a lot of armor, just have the shield. The shield is armor that you can just carry around with you. But even with that, I think snake people would still want to primarily be ambush fighters. Tactically, snake people wouldn't want to go for these long, drawn-out duels just based on the small amount of armor they can have. The longer a fight goes on, the more opportunities to be hurt a snake person has. They'd want the fight over as fast as possible, and the fastest way to do that is to surprise attack an unaware target. And snake people have a plethora of ways to do this. They can strike at a target that doesn't know they're there, use that initial shock to move in for constriction, or, if they have venom available to them, they can poison the target and then just retreat back into the shadows. It's precision and power, but mostly precision. With that style of combat in mind, plus the natural advantages they would have as snake people, there is one weapon that really comes to mind. Spears! The spear is the perfect weapon for snake people. Not only does it allow them to keep some distance between them and what they're fighting, adding in another layer of protection via that distance a spear would allow for, but it would also pair really well with the ability of a snake person to strike. When they lunge forward at great speed, pairing their natural striking instincts with a spear would allow a snake person to strike from a ridiculously far distance. And if they don't pair it with their ability to strike, well, a snake person still has all the benefits of using a spear. They can feint, they can jab, and they can counter just as well as a human can. And if you combine this with their natural serpentine movement, you've really got an absolute nightmare to pin down. Onto the types of spears that I think snake people would favor, I think they would mostly want to be using primarily more light spears, ones that have more narrow, possibly even armor-piercing heads, and the reason for that is that they would need pretty good point control, because having a heavier spearhead is sort of harder to control, especially since they would want to be using it in one hand to strike at vital points or gaps in the armor, while their other hand would preferably be using a shield. I also think that snake people would want to make use of some types of bladed weapons, and ones that really come to mind, at least for me, are sickle-bladed swords. Swords like the falx or the sika, which, besides being really nasty-looking blades, offer some pretty devastating chopping power. The two-handed version of the falx was considered more of a short polearm than it was a sword, and there are reports that a falx was able to split early Roman shields in two with one blow. But the primary benefit of the falx was the ability to strike around somebody's shield and also hook and pull your opponent, which I think would pair really, really well with a constricting snake person, where they would strike out with their sword, catch a shield or somebody's clothing, and then just pull them into a constriction, which would be nightmarish to face, especially if they struck from a distance and then just reeled you in like a big fishing rod. You would be pulled away from any allies or help that you could get, and then this giant snake person would wrap around you and just crush you. Now, with melee options covered, what about ranged options? Snake people already have a huge amount of range even with their melee weapons, but what if they needed to go a little bit further? Well, the basic answer would be the bow, of course, because most things are good with the bow. It's a great choice most of the time. It does everything that you would need a ranged weapon to do, plus they're just really neat. But personally, I have a bit more of an exotic option in mind when it comes to snake people, because they're built very differently. Their biology lends itself, in my opinion, to a more explosive form of ranged combat, that being a thrown ranged weapon. And when it comes to thrown weapons, the javelin is a really devastating choice. But I think instead of a typical javelin, the snake people would want to use a variant known as a war dart, which, when you look at it, has the appearance of a large arrow, essentially. But war darts are much heavier than an arrow, longer, and carry a lot more kinetic energy. An accurately thrown war dart can punch through armor, shields, or even just outright skewer lightly armored targets. And with the snake person's ability to poison their weapons, if a war dart were to hit you, you're not just wounded, you're finished. But it gets even better, because a war dart can be either thrown by hand or with a device known as a spear thrower or an atlatl, which is basically a length of typically wood with a spur on one end that knocks into the dart and artificially lengthens the thrower's arm so they would get more leverage and velocity when throwing the dart. And this pretty basic tool makes a huge difference. Using an atlatl will increase accuracy, power, and range by quite a lot, in some cases even doubling them, which is really impressive for a tool that was made as far back as the Paleolithic era. I think this focus on throwing spears or darts would work incredibly well with snake person biology, because using an atlatl rewards explosive, whip-fast motion, much like a snake's ability to strike. Just imagine a snake person armed with an atlatl can channel that sudden, powerful burst of speed in their strike and lunge forward, going at the high amount of speed of their strike already, and then on top of that, using the extra leverage and velocity of the atlatl to throw this giant, heavy arrow, basically, insanely hard and fast. The force that would be able to produce, I think, can rival or exceed most bows. And here is the absolute cherry on top. You can throw these darts and still have a shield in your hand. In fact, you can carry your additional darts in your shield hand. That is huge. Now, a snake person can lob darts from range and still have a shield, keeping itself safe from oncoming attacks. That is, if you even see it coming when it ambushes you. It's a fast, brutal, and efficient way of combat, just like snakes would use. So those are my 2 cents on the topic of what arms and armor best suit a snake person. Armor that has to be flexible and protective, chainmail, scale, lamellar, and of course a shield of some kind. Best overall weapon is the spear because of the crazy range a snake person can get out of it, with an honorable mention of sickle swords like the falx. Ranged weapons are obviously the bow. Can't really get away from how good bows are, they're just gonna be a reoccurring thing. But I hope I also made a convincing case for the javelin and the war dart, especially with the use of an atlatl. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this first episode of Forged by Fable. This is pretty different than my usual content, but I really enjoyed making it and getting to talk about all this really fun stuff. Make sure to let me know what you think, and I hope to see you again next time.